In this video, we're going to be taking a look at two trashy topics, 8.9 and 8.10, solid waste disposal and waste reduction methods. Solid waste includes everything that isn't a liquid or gas. It's materials you produce in your homes, as well as schools and businesses, agriculture, industry, and even inside of hospitals that need to be disposed of. Collectively referred to as municipal solid waste, or MSW, the material moves from location to location through what we call a waste stream. Ultimately, the waste reaches its final destination, such as an incinerator or a landfill, or perhaps even a recycling plant. Occasionally, though, waste does end up in less than desirable places, or may even be dumped illegally. The composition of municipal solid waste includes a variety of materials, oftentimes stuff that's potentially recyclable or compostable. This diagram here illustrates the kinds of materials that we find in MSW. As you can see, the vast majority, 64% of it, is potentially compostable. We'll take a look at the concept of composting a bit later on. Some of the MSW, like that in the plastics category, the metals category, and the glass category, may also be recyclable. The chart on the right illustrates the sources of MSW. Durable goods include long-lasting things like appliances, whereas non-durable goods need to be purchased more frequently. Food and yard waste are pretty self-explanatory. In spite of the fact that most MSW can be diverted to recycling or composting facilities, most of it ends up in landfills. This is information from 2014 from a site that tracks the kind of waste that we produce here in the United States. Just over half of that waste ends up in landfills. So, let's take a look at how a landfill works. Landfills, often referred to as sanitary landfills, are the most common method for disposing of MSW. They're essentially big holes in the ground into which trash is buried. But a little bit more complex than that, though. When we describe a landfill as being sanitary, that means that it has features that allow for groundwater surrounding it to be protected from contamination, as well as a system that we use to collect liquids and methane that are produced as the waste decomposes. Sanitary landfills are engineered facilities designed to hold MSW with as little contamination of the surrounding environment as possible. They are constructed with a clay or plastic lining to impede water flow and retain potentially toxic metal ions. A system of pipes is constructed below the landfill to collect leachate, which is the moisture that is compressed out of the waste being buried. The leachate is tested regularly for toxicity. If it exceeds toxicity standards set by regulations, landfill operators are required to collect it and treat it as a toxic waste. Once full, a landfill is closed and capped off. The absence of oxygen in many landfills slows down the process of decomposition and results in the production of methane, so a methane extraction system is constructed to prevent the buildup of the gas. It is often collected and used in natural gas power plants for the production of electricity. The decomposition of waste within a landfill varies depending on the type of material, as well as oxygen availability and water availability. Obviously, certain materials like glasses, plastics, and metals aren't going to decompose as quickly as paper products or food waste. Take a look at the short video linked above, produced by Waste Management, that will illustrate how landfills are constructed and how they're managed. In the realm of waste disposal, electronic waste, or e-waste, is a special category all to its own. Even though our electronic waste makes up only a portion of the total waste stream, the fact that those products, like cell phones and computers and televisions, they all contain toxic materials, and disposal needs to be handled in a different manner than simply dumping it into a landfill. The presence of toxic materials, including heavy metals like lead, mercury, and cadmium, mean that their disposal in a landfill could potentially contaminate groundwater supplies. So they need to be disposed of in a different process. Unfortunately, the recycling of these materials oftentimes is cost prohibitive, so they end up being disposed of in an improper way or shipped off to places where people are desperate to earn a living, oftentimes in developing countries. That ends up meaning that the people that are disposing of and processing our electronic waste usually don't have the personal protective equipment or protective measures in place so that they don't come in contact with toxic materials. An international treaty called the Basel Convention on the Control of Transboundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal, or simply Basel, was first introduced in 1989 and opened to signatures by countries in 1992. It was supposed to prevent more affluent nations from passing on their waste to less affluent nations. As of 2018, 186 countries, as well as the entire European Union, have signed and ratified this international treaty. There are still, however, 2 countries that have yet to ratify the treaty, and that includes Haiti and the United States. Another thing we do to waste is burn it. Waste incineration, as an alternative to burying trash in landfills, the volume of waste can be reduced by incinerating it. Depending on the efficiency of the waste incinerator, the volume of waste that can be reduced is as much as 90%. That would save large amounts of space within the landfill, extending the life of that landfill. Unfortunately, burning the waste, as you can probably imagine, does have some side effects and consequences. One of which is the release of ash or particulates into the atmosphere. And of course, we know that all combustion reactions release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. One positive side effect of waste incineration is that we can use the heat generated from waste incineration to heat up water, to make steam, to turn a turbine, to turn a generator, to generate electricity. The diagram illustrates the process by which waste is incinerated. Relatively straightforward, it begins with dumping or tipping of waste into a bunker that would then be incinerated. After burning, the remaining ash is collected and taken away to a landfill. There are different methods in place to capture as much of the ash material as possible from being released into the atmosphere. You may recall learning about baghouse filters in the previous unit. The next category is toxic waste. Toxic waste is identified as such because it cannot simply be disposed of in a sanitary landfill. It needs to be processed using special methods or recycled using special techniques to ensure that the toxic nature of their content is not released out into the environment. Some of the most common toxic materials that you may be familiar with include things like batteries, car batteries, tires, appliances, and even paint. None of these things can be disposed of directly into a landfill, so instead, they first need to be broken down into their component parts. For example, products containing copper or other metals could be removed from them and then recycled. The plastic and glass could be removed, crushed, and processed and either recycled or disposed of in a landfill. Products that contain chemicals in them would need to be treated to prevent animals and plants from being exposed to them. A lot of trash ends up in water, in streams and rivers, which lead to deltas and bays and ultimately to the ocean. Disposal of MSW in waterways is especially prevalent in developing nations, where the infrastructure to dispose of waste properly is inadequate or practically absent. Since you don't see the trash, it's no longer a local problem. But this tactic obviously has led to large volumes of trash floating in the ocean and endangering wildlife. This is a powerful example of the tragedy of the commons since, like the atmosphere, Earth's oceans are a commons. The most famous of these is probably the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It is the most conspicuous example of the kind of harm that's being done by dumping trash directly into waterways or into the ocean. Watch the video from 60 Minutes linked above that will illustrate the concept of and issues around the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. The production of waste is an inevitable, unavoidable part of living in a modern industrialized society. No matter how hard we try, no matter how much recycling or reducing or reusing we do, waste production will always be a fact of life. Whether it's the packaging materials that your Amazon delivery came in, or even unused building materials, waste happens. And as populations grow and consumption of goods increases, inevitably, the amount of waste that's produced is also going to continue to grow. Using different strategies, we can reduce the amount of waste that ends up in landfills, thereby extending the life of those landfills. We can also ensure the protection and the quality of our groundwater, even reducing the need for mining and extracting new fossil fuels and promoting and preserving natural spaces like parks and other recreational areas. The most well-known method by which we can reduce waste is recycling. Recycling involves the breakdown of goods and products that we've disposed of into their component parts and materials. For example, that could mean breaking apart a product to extract the plastic from it, the metals, or even the glass, and then recycling those components into new plastics, new metals, and new glass that can be used to form new products. Commonly recycled materials include things like paper products, plastics, metals, and of course glass. Plastic is a really great example of a recyclable product because of the fact that in order to produce plastic, we need to extract fossil fuels from the earth and refine it. By recycling plastics, we can greatly reduce the amount of fossil fuels that need to be extracted for that purpose. On some of the plastic products you use, you've probably recognized these chasing arrow diagrams that illustrate what kind of plastic it is and that they are in fact recyclable materials. The video linked above shows how one of the largest recycling facilities in New York City processes some of its recyclable waste. You'll probably recognize a number of materials, perhaps from your everyday life, that could have been recycled. Because recycling reduces the demand for new raw materials to be taken from the earth, this helps us to preserve habitats for species, also reduces pollution, including that which comes from fossil fuels in the extraction process. There are two primary types of recycling. The first is closed-loop recycling. In closed-loop recycling, discarded materials are recycled into new materials of the same type. Although some additional energy and new raw material is needed, far less of it is required since the recycled material make up the bulk of the new product. In open-loop recycling, materials are recycled into some new, different kind of product. As shown in the diagram, for example, a plastic bottle may be recycled and processed into fibers that can be used to make a fleece jacket. Unfortunately, most potentially recyclable products don't end up being recycled, and rather end up in landfills instead. Recycling is an energy-intensive process and somewhat expensive. Not only that, but certain recycling processes, like that for which paper is used, does require the use of pretty high amounts of fresh water. Additionally, some countries that had been previously accepting recyclable products from the US and Europe have halted these imports. Another method by which we can reduce waste is by composting. Composting is a process that utilizes aerobic microorganisms, those that use oxygen, to biodegrade certain kinds of materials. The kinds of materials that we can compost include food waste, yard clippings, and uncoated paper products, those paper products that don't have a plastic or waxy coating on them. That resulting material, which we call compost, is very nutrient rich and can be used as a fertilizer. This diagram here, in a really simple way, illustrates the composting process. Aerobic microorganisms, along with the compostable material, are mixed together, along with oxygen from the atmosphere, and slowly biodegrades that material into compost. Water vapor and an increase in temperature also occur, and a little bit of carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. Composting facilities can sometimes attract pests, especially during certain stages of the composting process, and, quite frankly, it doesn't smell too good either. Landfills are not going to go away anytime soon. Even if we were to recycle everything that we possibly could, there is still going to be a need for us to have a location into which we can deposit our non-recyclable goods. What waste reduction allows us to do is extend the life of those landfills because the volume of the waste going into them would also be reduced. Another relationship to landfills is that as those materials break down in an anaerobic process without oxygen, there is methane gas that is produced by those chemical reactions. The methane gas that's produced by that can then be captured and used to produce electricity. That would help us to reduce the need for mining and drilling for new fossil fuels as a source of electricity generation. That wraps up these two topics. Thanks for watching. Take care.